Okay, so the third book which I want to show you in talking about the Civil War is Memoirs of a Cavalier, or to give it its full title, Memoirs of a Cavalier, or a military journey of the wars in Germany and the wars in England from the year 1632 to the year 1648, written above 80 years ago by an English gentleman who served first in the army of Gustavus Adolphus, the glorious King of Sweden, until his death, and after that in the royal army of King Charles I from the beginning of the rebellion to the end of that war. Now, this is an interesting book. This was first published in 1720, and actually the title of the first edition, rather than saying written above 80 years ago, says written 80 years ago, which would intend that it was written around about 1660. So first edition was published in 1720 and was published anonymously. And in the preface to that edition in the discussion about it, it's bemoaned the fact that the author of it hasn't given his name, that there's no way of working out who that person is, and is stating that it's a shame that it doesn't go beyond 1648, and wondering whether maybe there may be more of this manuscript somewhere about. The second edition was published around about 1750 and was printed in Leeds, and in the preface to that one is the comment, some have imagined the whole to be a romance, meaning it to be a novel rather than to be a work of fact. But it says, but it has all the features of the truth. And in that preface to the second edition, the publishers even suggest a possible name for the person who could have written it, Andrew Newport, the second son of Richard Newport of High Ercole, who was created Lord Newport in 1642, and Andrew Newport went on to be a Commissioner of Customs after the war. However, by the time we get to the Edinburgh edition of 1809, of which this one is a reprint, we have the comment in the preface that the Memoirs of a Cavalier have long been ascertained to be the production of Daniel Defoe. So as with a number of other works by Daniel Defoe, when this was first published anonymously and without any kind of explanation, it was taken to be factual. It was taken to be an actual account of events as witnessed by the person who wrote it. Similarly to the Journal of the Plague Year, that was also taken to be factually at first. But by the time we get to this edition, it has been established that this is actually a novel written by Daniel Defoe, although it has an awful lot of detailed information, and as one can often see with his works, he's clearly done an awful lot of research into the period that he's talking about. So Daniel Defoe, I'm sure everyone's heard of Daniel Defoe. He was born around about 1660, so around about the same time as the Restoration, as Charles II came to the throne. So by the time he was writing this, it would have been 50 or 60 years after the period that he's writing about. And he was an incredibly prolific writer. He wrote pamphlets, he was a journalist, he wrote for newspapers and periodicals. He was a very political writer. And in discussing his work subsequently, it has been claimed that he was one of the people most responsible for popularising the format of the novel in English. Or the romance as it was referred to then. So he was born in London and he was aged around about 5 or 6 when the plague and the Great Fire of London occurred. So his Journal of the Plague Year was speaking about a time that he actually lived through, although it's unlikely that he would have remembered all that much about it. He had a rather unsuccessful career as a merchant. He was often in debt, but from the late 1690s he started to publish written works. I mean, he was very politically active, and he ended up in prison for his political activism as well as for being in debt, mainly through writing pamphlets and so on. And it wasn't until 1719 that he published his first novel, which was Robinson Crusoe. So he published many of these anonymously, he published them under pen names, and this was something that was very common in the 18th century. So subsequently there has been a lot of work for people working in literary criticism to try and ascertain which works were actually written by Daniel Defoe and which works do not belong to his particular canon. So this particular book starts with a long section on the 30 Years' War, so the 30 Years' War within Central Europe from 1618 to 1648, which started within the Holy Roman Empire. And it mentions the protagonist as being part of the Swedish army, which intervened in that particular war. And then it goes on to the second section, which is where it talks about the Civil War in England. The protagonist being part of the Royalist army, and it describes the various battles and the life of a soldier in those particular, throughout the war. So it's interesting. It's interesting as it is clearly a fictionalised account. From looking at the two previous books that I've introduced you to in this particular session, one wonders how much more fictionalised this is than maybe some of the information that was being presented as historical fact at the time. But we have a number of copies of this in various different parts of the museum collection, the library collection, and yeah, so this is available for library members to borrow and read if they want to.